Stand by. Let me now bring in Dan Perry. You've covered this region for decades. I mean, Trump predicts this will make Iran come back to the negotiating table and give the United States everything it wants. Those were his words. How realistic is that outcome?
I don't think even Trump believes it. But the question is whether the Iranians can be compelled to give the United States enough. And I think enough may be backtracking on the entire Strait of Hormuz blockade and the nuclear file. The United States, very interestingly, is also calling for an end to the funding of proxy militias. That's wonderful, but that amounts to surrender terms for Iran. And my guess is maybe there can be some flexibility there. But the question is whether what remains of the Iranian regime could be persuaded of anything. And we have a dangerous situation here that's extremely volatile, where I think both sides feel they have leverage. And if neither will come down, then a scenario for escalation seems to be certainly not unlikely.
Ambassador, this ceasefire was already on shaking ground, last week ahead of the vice president, even leading negotiations in Pakistan over the weekend. Now you've got the blockade coming. What's the potential for fighting to begin again this week?
So even through what seemed like a negotiation that didn't yield any real results, it didn't seem like anybody was backing away from the ceasefire. And it is, of course, a bit tenuous. I think Gulf states have continued to get fired upon by the Iranians. The Israelis are still at war in southern Lebanon. But there is an element of a ceasefire there. That's partly what gives me a little bit of hope that both sides are just trying to maximize leverage.
Before Operation Epic Fury began, you were looking at 120 to 140 cargo ships going through a day. And I would point you back to the International Energy Agency's comments in which they said that they believe that the fuel shortage, particularly when it comes to jet fuel, will start to hit Europe by the end of April, beginning of May, laid out the possibility that it impacts commercial flights around Europe as well. Those are some of the timelines that you're working with here, which is why the Strait of Hormuz starts to have this broad sweeping impact outside of the Gulf, outside of the Middle East, into the region and to the hemisphere at large. Markey? Dan,
will we see some of our allies now step in to help out with the strait and blocking it? I know Trump is now saying Britain is sending in minesweepers. That's a pretty big change of tone. They didn't even want the United States to share bases for this operation.
Yeah. They may send in minesweepers, but Starmer also said, just I believe in the past 24 hours, that the UK will not be dragged into war. On the other hand, Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, was critical of some NATO countries, saying we didn't step up quickly enough. There clearly is a very big internal disagreement and ongoing discussion among America's NATO allies and in Europe in general, which they hate more. Giving in to Iran in a way by not assisting at all in this effort versus Trump, who has been insulting and demeaning them and basically has not acted like an ally for a year and a half. They're in a pickle in this regard, and I can't predict which way they're going to go, but I suspect increasingly you'll see incremental assistance. Will it really make a difference when the U.S. has the largest army in the world by far? I kind of doubt it. The problem here is that if the war resumes, then it's not like the strait is going to open by May or June. We heard Robert talking about the jet fuel issue. That means that there's going to be a lot of pain in the global economy. The Iranians are simply assuming that if they buy time and they stall and they make clear that they're not going to back down, despite having been militarily thrashed, just as Trump says, well, then the U.S. will kind of walk away. And I can't predict if that will happen or not, but I'll say this. Trump is not a regular politician where you can say, okay, given that this is a landscape, he can't afford to resume the war before the midterms because that'll harm the Republicans. Yeah. I think he might just go the other way.
Joe, let me end with you on this. Dan brings up some really good points there. And speaking of disagreements, today is Congress's first day back to Washington, D.C. after a 2-week Easter recess. What's the word that you're hearing from your sources about support for this war? And is there any talk about the likelihood of war power limits resolutions?
I think for the most part, Republicans are still supportive of the war effort, even the ones who a year ago, were very anti-intervention. Those kinds of Republicans still, just even yesterday, told me they have faith that President Trump will finish this through, we'll see this through, and that there may be a better outcome at the end of it. But I think if this sort of drags on, there is going to be a point where you're going to start to see more and more Republicans as we get closer to the midterms, be a little bit more uneasy and perhaps sort of shift, publicly what they're saying in terms of, okay, we can move forward with military action. This week, I think, is going to be a critical one to watch for those war powers resolutions.
Yeah, and the next few hours, depending on how these play out, will be consequential as well. Joe and Robert, thank you. Dan Perry, Ambassador Michael Ratney, thank you both as well. Really appreciate your time on an early Monday morning.